Today, I will tell you the story of arguably the most successful businessman in history. The man whose business empire became so big and powerful that at some point the US government had to intervene to reduce its dominance. Of course, we're talking about John D. Rockefeller and his company Standard Oil, which, at its peak, controlled 90% of the oil industry in the USA. Today, we'll follow Rockefeller's entire business path, right from the day he started his first company to the moment when he dominated the oil industry and became the richest man in the world. The story begins in Richford, New York, where in 1839, John D. Rockefeller was born. His father was a traveling salesman, which made the family move several times before settling in Cleveland, Ohio, where the young Rockefeller got his first job as an assistant bookkeeper. When he was 20 years old, he started his first business with a partner, Maurice Clark. The two partners raised $4,000 in capital and founded a commission business, which was trading in grain, hay, meats, and other goods. However, when the Pennsylvania oil rush started, Clark and Rockefeller saw the business potential in oil production. At that time, inexperienced oil drillers flooded Pennsylvania with the hopes of making it big, but most of them failed. So instead of joining the thousands of people drilling for crude oil, Rockefeller and his partner decided to buy from them and refine it into the finished products. Back then, the major petroleum product in demand was kerosene, which was used as oil for lamps. The market was booming, but most refineries at the time only used about 60% of the crude oil and discarded the remaining 40%. Rockefeller abhorred waste, and he became keen on looking for efficient methods to refine crude oil. He brought in Samuel Andrews, a chemist who had experience in refining, to join his business. Andrews devised new processes to create better products and reduced wastage. So instead of dumping gasoline into the river, Rockefeller used it to fuel his machines. Instead of discarding other products, such as tar, naphtha, and petroleum jelly, he found a way to sell them. Rockefeller's thrifty nature also helped him reduce the cost of refining oil in other aspects. For instance, he hired his own plumbers to cut the cost of pipe laying and built his own cooperage shop to make barrels instead of buying. He bought timber tracts to get wood for the barrels and bought wagons to transport the wood to the cooperage shop in Cleveland. Thanks to these clever moves, he managed to reduce the cost of pipe laying by half and cut the cost of each produced barrel by more than 50%. Rockefeller would borrow more money and invest all the profits back into the business. This allowed him to grow rapidly and gain more control over the industry. The initial oil rush had died down, and Rockefeller now had the largest oil refinery in the world. Meanwhile, Rockefeller and Andrews were joined by Henry Morrison Flagler and Rockefeller's brother William Rockefeller Jr., and on January 10, 1870, Standard Oil was formed. Because of the sheer size of the company, Rockefeller gained control over the railroad industry, which helped him transport his oil to other parts of the country at a cheaper price. As a bulk customer, he often got preferential treatment and discounts from railroad companies that made it impossible for many refineries to compete with him. Instead, he offered to buy out his competitors or they risk going out of business. He invites his competitors and shows them his books so that they could see what they were up against. He made them see that he could sell at a loss for a longer time and still remain in business until they eventually run out of money and close down. When this method didn't work, Rockefeller was able to erode the price of oil and kerosene, in some cases even by 80%. Thanks to this, the customers would choose him instead of his competitor. Furthermore, when Rockefeller was buying rival companies, he also offered a job to his former competitors, which enabled him to acquire the best specialists from the oil industry for his company. All these clever moves led to the moment when Rockefeller was refining 90% of all the oil in the United States. Despite that, Standard Oil largely contributed to the reduction in the price of kerosene products, as well as improving their quality and availability. The company's methods that prevented competition created controversies. After all, he was making secret deals with transportation companies, and in some cases, selling at a heavily discounted price to force his rivals out of business. Rockefeller was accused of monopolizing the oil industry, and in response to this, state laws were created to limit the scale of companies and prevent monopolistic behaviors. Legislators made it difficult to incorporate a business in one state and operate in another. However, Rockefeller was one step ahead. He had enough money to hire the best lawyers who found a way around the laws by creating the Standard Oil Trust in 1882. The trust allowed Rockefeller and his associates to own several corporations which operated across different states. In other words, the trust was a corporation of corporations. Eventually, Standard Oil reached its peak as oil from wells drilled in Russia and Asia began to reach the world market. Additionally, the invention of the light bulb gradually erodes the dominance of kerosene for illumination. But Rockefeller was quick to adapt by expanding its reach to Europe and starting production of natural gas as well as gasoline for the developing automobile industry. The really problematic thing for Standard Oil became the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed to prevent monopolies and allow free competition in the market. Since Standard Oil has been the subject of controversy for several years, it quickly attracted attention from antitrust authorities. But dealing with a company as wealthy and powerful as Standard Oil made this process more complicated. Standard Oil would bribe legislators and contribute to the political campaigns of their preferred candidates. When Theodore Roosevelt became president, his administration launched an investigation into Standard Oil's activities. The Justice Department sued Standard Oil Company in 1909 under the Sherman Antitrust Act for sustaining a monopoly. The evidence against Standard Oil was well documented. They had unfair advantages over competitors and paid lower fees to transport their goods. The local price cutting at the points where necessary to suppress competition also made it impossible for smaller businesses to compete against them. After some back and forth in the court, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil guilty of monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court ordered the company to break up into 34 independent companies in 1911. Some of these independent companies include the Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, and Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil. Later, the two companies merged to form ExxonMobil. Other relevant companies include, for example, Amoco and Chevron. By this time, Rockefeller was no longer taking any active management role in the company, but he saw his wealth increase tremendously after Standard Oil broke up. He owned over 25% of Standard Oil shares, and when the company broke up into independent companies, he and other shareholders received a proportionate value in each of the new companies. It turned out that in the years after the Standard Oil breakup, the individual companies significantly increased their worth, and thanks to the fact that Rockefeller still owned shares of these companies, his net worth also increased. Finally, Rockefeller's fortune reached a value that, adjusted to modern inflation, would be $26.1 billion. However, if we try to calculate his wealth as a percentage of then US GDP and compare it to the current US GDP, it would be between $300 to $400 billion. It was also worth mentioning that despite the controversies surrounding Rockefeller, he was a generous man who donated freely even when he was a clerk at age 16. The scale of his giving only increased as he became more wealthy. His philanthropy activity focused mainly on educational and public health purposes, but also on basic science and the arts. This was the story of how John D. Rockefeller built his business empire. If you want to see more stories about companies and entrepreneurs, then don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel.